July 22nd. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes or additions to the agenda? If not, I entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So move, Chair.
Second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay, and the agenda is approved. The next order of business is approval of the minutes from the June 24th, 2019 meeting. Did anyone have any changes or additions to the meeting minutes? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion to approve?
Motion, is there a second?
Seconded.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Next, we move on to employee recognition.
Great, thank
Manager
you.
Frazier.
I'm going to ask Antoinette Brisson to step forward, and she will lead the introduction of the individuals who played, and as I recall, a really important role in the Final Four.
Good afternoon, Chair Barber and committee members. I am Antoinette Brisson. I'm the manager of street operations for Metro Transit, and I have two of my employees, Daniel Craig and Brian Hansen, who I'll be recognizing today. And the reason for the nomination, Dan Craig was our lead street supervisor for the 2019 Final Four activities. He created all the detour routings, coordinated Minneapolis police shuttles, and he worked very hard to ensure that no piece of our plan was missed. His efforts ensured that operationally routing changes were consistent for our daily passengers through all of the festivities surrounding the Final Four. Dan took into consideration the many things which could occur and planned contingencies for those things. He successfully communicated routine updates to keep everyone in the know of what was happening. He worked numerous of hours to have a solid run through the Final Four, and his adaptability was ever present before, during, and after the events. He received many compliments from the city of Minneapolis on his professionalism, ability to adjust on very short notices, and keeping them informed of changes to shuttle routings for more efficient transport. He took the planning information provided and put a workable plan in place, which was one of the key successes for our buses detouring from Nicollet Mall to Hennepin Avenue. And as the incident commander for street operations, he ensured all additional staff dedicated to this event were informed and prepared for what was going on. He was a great team leader for transit operations during this major event, which highlighted our city. Great job, Dan.
Thank you.
The second person that I nominated was Supervisor Brian Hansen, and he was our evening lead for street operations for the 2019 Final Four activities. He worked closely with Dan Craig to have a seamless transition of roles during the Final Four. Brian was flexible to his late schedule for the duration of the Final Four. He understood the need to have a single point of contact and was accepting of that role in late night hours for the duration. He encountered minor issues while working the late evening, which he overcame without incident. Brian took all the steps necessary to keep internal partners updated daily, which painted a clear picture from the street and also aided me in my time in the MAC. His quick response and professionalism really showed when an operator misread their paddle, getting caught in a detoured area. Brian remained calm and successfully navigated the situation and was commended for his efforts by many of my peers within the multi-agency command center as we watched and saw the outcome. During the late evening hours, he quickly adjusted and worked with Minneapolis for short notice changes to shuttle needs based on delays from 6th Street traffic. Brian was a great asset to this event. He was a great team partner for transit operations during this major event, which highlighted our city. Great job, Brian.
We're going to give awards. This is Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
I'm going to give you the box.
I got the full card.
From the general manager, you get a box.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
All right. Next item on the agenda is our tab liaison report. We have Mr. Dugan. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the Transportation Committee, thank you, General Manager Koistra, Director Thompson. Again, my name is Peter Dugan. I'm a citizen representative for Dakota County, generally District H, and I have the privilege of keeping you up to date on what the tab is doing. In the interest of time and efficiency, I know you have a busy schedule, I'm going to alter this a little bit and start right away with the one item that is a consent agenda and one that will be coming up on the consent agenda at your next meeting. They're both TIP amendments. The first one is for Minnesota State Highway 21 and approximately Mill Street in Chair Barber's district. And the reason this is a TIP amendment, get into the weeds a little bit. The TIP is coming to you for final approval, and I'll explain the TIP again, in September. However, this particular project started July 1st. And because it's within the 2019-2022 TIP, that TIP must be amended, even though it's going to go into the 2023 TIP. That's a mouthful. Okay. And as you know, the TIP is federally required of all MPOs, must include all federally funded projects in part or in whole, and any project that affects air quality. And then that TIP is incorporated by MnDOT into the state transportation improvement plan. And to be qualified for TIP, the criteria must be fiscally balanced, which means the money must be available. It must be consistent with the Transportation Policy Plan, the TPP, in conformity with the Clean Air Act requirements, and there must be an opportunity for public input. And Director Thompson knows this inside out, as well as Joe Barbeau, another in-house expert. The second TIP amendment is for County State 8 Highway 81 in the general vicinity of the the Minneapolis-Robbinsdale border, which is District 7, Councilmember Lilligren. And it is, what makes this unique, it is a scope change, and perhaps at our next time, we'll go through what scope changes are and the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee to the TAB, the role that it has in a scope change. Scope change, as it says, is when the project scope or cost is changing. And in this case, it was approved by the TAC because the additional cost is absorbed locally, and by scoring, it would have been funded in any event, even if it had gone in. They're adding a third bridge. Okay. Next, I'll just bring you up to date. The TAB, the Met Council is doing a regional bicycle barriers update, and it's coming to the TAB. It's an ongoing project, basically to determine what are the regional barriers to the continuity of both the regional and the local bicycle networks. We also will bring you up to date on the regional solicitation policy work group, our session 4. Director Thompson will address you with session 5, which was today. The two main topics in session 4 were equity and how does transit planning and station planning under General Manager Koistra, what is the connection to jobs, first and foremost. In the transit discussion, there was a lot of discussion on the ABRT and how to fund them. Is it funding them a little bit at a time, or trying to set aside enough money to fund an ABRT all at once? And then I would like to conclude with the notes from the different agencies that reported to TAB last time. From MnDOT, as you know, in the Pioneer Press, there was a rather large article on congestion. The representative of MnDOT, the Metro District Engineer, which is basically the chief engineer for the state, said it had not received any feedback, and the I-494 engagement with the public is continuing. As a matter of fact, there is a meeting tomorrow at Best Buy on freight moving through the I-494 corridor. That project, Corridors of Commerce, is from 169 to the airport. From the MPCA, the VW settlement, just in case this comes up with your constituents, there were 40 for the truck and bus grants. There were 40 applications worth $7 million applied, turned in. Only $3.7 million is available. The next grants are for heavy-duty electric, only electric, and clean diesel off-road vehicles. Not buses and things, but off-road, the big trucks, things of that nature. And from the MAC, and this, I think, is probably most applicable to all of you because, and of course, General Manager Koister, because this will impact a major bus line, the reconstruction of Highway 5, which is, as you know, is the main entrance to the airport. And that will take place next summer. I believe it is, Nick, I mean, I think it starts in spring into November?
April to November, yes.
Okay, thank you. And the access to the airport will be shut down in each direction for a period of time. So one side will be closed and the other side, and people coming there will need to go totally around the airport to get in, to kind of the back entrance. And that will, again, General Manager Koister would know, is going to affect bus route 54, which goes generally from the Maplewood Park and Ride to the Mall of America and the airport. It goes through Councilmember Vento's district, Councilmember Lee's district, and then, of course, Councilmember Sterner's district, the airport, and the Mall of America. In addition, on the construction at the airport continues in 2020 and 2021 will be the most intense. It ends in 2023, and the new escalators to Delta and all the other airlines are installed. So when you go there, you won't taking the short escalator to the, you come in, there used to be the short escalator and the long one. It's all the long one now. And there's a new a new entrance to the baggage claim, coming down from both sides as opposed to in the middle. So you'll walk the whole circuit and you'll know where your bags are. And on the fund side, you can tell your constituents and members and citizens that the airport continues to receive multiple awards. They were awarded the third best airport in the country by Travel and Leisure magazine, and what are called Tele Awards, which are video and TV broadcasting awards, in which they compete for video explanations of what they're doing at the airport, and they beat such companies as CBS and Bloomberg. If there are no questions, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dugan. Any questions?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Madam Chair.
All right, we'll move on now to reports. We've got MTS Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, council members, a few reports tonight from MTS. First, following up on Peter's comments, today was the 5th of 6 meetings from the Regional Solicitation Working Group that member Barber and Cummings are on, as well as 3 council citizen reps. They are the subgroup of TAB that are in the council that are working on some changes to the next application of the solicitation. They expect to get their final recommendations on April 5th. Those full recommendations will go to TAB in August. Final recommendations, August 5th, excuse me. And today we discussed creating a category for innovation. There's been a lot of projects that have come in that over the years and TAB has struggled with whether they're good projects and should they be funded. And today the recommendation that will go forward to TAB is that we create a whole category for innovation with up to 2.5% of the funds that are available going to projects on that. And that would be for projects starting 2 years from now, people could apply for it. So that's kind of a new category that is being it's been around, but it's basically trying to streamline how it works, but also encourage innovative projects in transportation that affect the region. So that is a major step that came out of that group. Also today we continued our discussion about how equity is scored within all the categories. And it was probably, I think, our 3rd meeting on that. Well, one more, we didn't quite finish it. But to really moving towards a new way to score that, I think the group really wanted to make sure that equity was having more influence on the categories. And then so a proposal was submitted today by my staff that was developed around increasing the scoring, having training created by the council that we provide to all applicants, really focusing on applicants going out and making sure that they're getting input in the projects before they apply for them, and really awarding a good approach to equity on all their applications, be it a bike project, a roadway project, or a transit project. No conclusion to that was made, but we can send around that proposal if you'd like to look at it. Um, and yeah, I'm sure you'll have some questions because if you haven't went through regional solicitation, there's a lot of detail there. But I'd be happy to meet with you. But they'll be hopefully making a final kind of recommendation from this group in August 5th about that proposal. And all these recommendations go to TAB in August for an information, and then in September, TAB approves all these changes as part of a draft release of the application. So there's still time for input, but I think some good changes are being recommended from this group. And every 2 years, as a solicitation comes up, we are making changes to that solicitation. This year, probably a little bit bigger than normal because of we've created this working group. So good progress there. We, as Peter mentioned, the tip is out for public comment still. We had weather impacted an info event past weekend. Weather impacted a lot of things, but we were trying an info event for the tip. But really, during the public input period, we receive a lot of comments from agencies and changes they might have learned about a new project that isn't in there and changes. And we'll get maybe a couple comments from the public about specific comments, but we are in the public comment period, so I wanted to mention that. And when that closes, we'll brief you on the comments received as part of the approval of that tip in September. And lastly, on the street is our request for proposals on our expansion of the Metro Mobility Premium On-Demand service. This is probably, I'd say, the number one recommendation that came out of the Metro Mobility Task Force in 2017. And so we're making progress and hoping we have some that apply for this to expand the Metro Mobility service to add things like same-day service if there's applications. So we won't know until the RFP closes, but it is out there, and so we're letting potential businesses know about this. And with that, Madam Chair, that concludes my remarks.
Any questions for Director Thompson? Councilmember Atlas and Gerbranson.
Just a quick question. I'm still kind of getting my bearings. What is the best way? It would be really helpful for me, I think, if we have public requests or public input events or opportunities to get something shareable, directly sent, something shareable, meaning over social media platforms. And sometimes we get a lot of information, as you can imagine. And I know we get newsletters of things, but that's something that I think is one place that's a uniquely specific role to us, is making sure information about how public and agencies, of course, in our communities can get engaged or share their input. So is there a thing that exists currently, or is there a way maybe we could do that? Who are we looking at? Who are we eyeballing?
I'm looking at Sarah.
I'm looking at.
She wants to
I'm
speak
also
to,
looking at Sarah.
Yes, there is. Let's go to the expert.
Yeah, so typically we've always, like you, Met Council or Metro Transit post things and they're easily shareable, but there have been a few times where we've gotten specific links to send out.
Yes, I at this point, we don't send you material that you can post, but we do have Facebook and Twitter. We post all on those accounts. Are you requesting to have something written up that you can share? Or do you want to just know when the posts are live so you can share them?
I think it'd be nice to know when posts are live so that we could share them, but I am open to hearing that it might be nice to have some language about something that was appropriate for us to add or to highlight.
Okay.
So perhaps we could work with the chair's office to have it added to the daily report or some of those things. So there's shareable links or notice when those things are going out. Maybe?
Yep, I can work with that.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, I'm also thinking that with the communications department, we may be able to get some communication widgets that are shareable. A lot of times, if we have the widgets kind of set up so that when you post, it posts the link to the site. It also may post a picture and contacts, that kind of information. But what we really need is a shareable link and a short description to share on social media. And I would think that could be part of the way that communication happens.
On the back end, we use Hootsuite, to schedule all of our posts so we know in advance when they're going.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that we have a widget that can do what you're asking, but I'm not sure exactly.
If I may, Chair, I can talk offline about any
Great.
potential widgets and also just maybe just what kind of links that we need to
Sure.
be able to send for social media.
Sounds good.
Very good. All right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, then we will turn to General Manager Cloister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few brief updates. First, on the electric bus, I sent an email out last week mentioning that we were pulling electric buses off the C line because we were having issues with the charging stations at the Haywood facility. We've been having issues all along that we've been working on and trying to get resolved, and they weren't getting resolved, and problems of overheating and blowing fuses and other problems related to overheating. The decision, and it was a mutual decision between the council and New Flyer, was we should probably pull those chargers off. We should pull those chargers off, get a permanent fix to them, and get them back on so we can get the buses running. I was told that this morning, and I believe it has arrived, that a temporary charger was being sent to us. I believe it was from British Columbia, as I recall, that Siemens was sending to us so that we can get some of the buses back online. I think we have, as you recall, 8 electric buses. I think we'll be able to get 3 or 4 of them back online. And so we'll be able to provide some electric bus service until they're doing this workaround. I know that New Flyer and their subcontractor for these stations, Siemens, is motivated to find a permanent fix for it. And I think we've been working really closely ever since the C line started on trying to resolve this issue. I think the issue kept getting worse, and so we didn't see it coming to this point. And then when it did come to this point, we needed to pull the trigger on pulling the buses off. But again, I think as early as later this week, we'll have electric buses back online. Not as many. As what we have as the 8. It'll be 3 to 4 of them will be back. And we were able to replace the lost electric buses with diesel buses between our A line and C line so that it still had the branding of the bus, of the arterial bus rapid transit on it. So it didn't create any change or any delay in service. Didn't have a service impact other than the electric bus being pulled off the line. And we'll keep you updated as we know more from Siemens and New Flyer, our primary contractor.
Any questions? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are these common issues that startup with electric buses experience in other parts of the country or the world where they're used, or?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Cummings, I don't know if this particular one's a common issue. The replacement charger that we're receiving is another Siemens charger that was an earlier model, and this is a new model that we're using. I think I would say that we knew that we were going to confront some issues. We didn't know what issues they were because we're taking on new technology. And that's in part why we phased in the use of the technology, because we need to learn as we go. So we're not happy about this by any means, but it's not that but we always expected that there would be some challenges in this. The good news is when we do charge the buses are our modeling of the distance the bus could go on a charge has been almost exactly right on. So it's not a bus issue, it's a charging system issue.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. Are there any cost recapturing or this? I know no one planned for this to be the situation, probably on the vendor's end or on our end, but what are we doing or are we getting from them to manage the expense of having to do the shift to other buses? And
Madam Chair, Council Member, I asked the same question. I don't think the contract allows for that I'm aware of for cost recapturing on this. It does. The warranty is being delayed, of course, on the start of the warranty and so forth. But I asked the same question, and there's, to my knowledge, and I'm looking at staff, there's not a cost recapture in the contract.
Not for the chargers. For the buses there is, but not for the chargers. So I guess one could argue they go hand in hand. We've had those discussions. One doesn't work without the other. But specific to the charger, there's nothing in the contract.
So we're just eating the expenses of the shift.
Madam Chair,
Or-
I don't think the expense, we haven't had to deal with great expense on this at this point, other than, you're right, there's staff time and so forth of taking the buses off the street, but we haven't had significant expense as a result of this. I don't want to,
Okay.
I'm not, I asked the same question that you're asking, and I'm not trying to diminish that issue. And I think it's a live and learn issue for sure. But I don't think we've, to my knowledge, have experienced any significant expense on this other than staff costs.
And then just one follow-up, and we're staying committed to having electric buses on the Sea Line. That's still our goal.
Madam Chair, absolutely. And our goal is to have electric buses on more than the Sea Line. Again, it's new technology. We're learning. Our contractors are learning. We're pushing, and I think our contractors are motivated to get it taken care of.
And if I may, I think this is part of the reason things like this is why we wanted to do it with a specific line and start working on phasing things in over time so that we knew that as we go electric, we've got everything well handled and good understanding of it. So, any other questions for Mr. Questra? All right, if not, then we will move on to, oh, pardon me.
I have a couple more.
Oh, I
but
thought you were done.
I'll do it quickly. We got heavily into the Sea Line buses. Sorry. I also wanted to mention, you may have seen this in the news, but we're really excited that the city of Minneapolis is going to be bringing bus-only lanes to 3 of the busy corridors, and that's for Hennepin, Chicago, Necklet Avenue. That'll start this fall, and this is something that we've been wanting to do for some time. There was a pilot on Hennepin at one point, and they pulled the pilot, and there was some, I think, public discussion about that, but they're kind of going in with a more aggressive approach to doing this, and we're really happy about it. Now, the difficulty of doing it, why it's not an easy decision, is it affects parking on the street. So we're trying to work closely with businesses and helping Minneapolis work with businesses on dealing with that issue, and we're going to go through the process of doing some information for local residents and so forth. But it's good news for transit. It'll help with our routes and make our routes faster and more accessible as we go through. And then wanted to also mention that we had another big event. It wasn't the Final Four. It wasn't the Super Bowl. It was the Lutherans that came to town, and 20,000 Lutherans who came to town and actually increased our ridership over that 5-day period by 20%.
Wow.
It was they really used transit. I was told by our operations people that they actually cheered every train that came. We need more enthusiasm like that. Let me tell you. But there was over that period of time, which I believe was a 5-day event. There was 81,000 more rides than usual. We sold more than 7,000 wristbands to attendees. It's the first time we've used that method for verifying payment. I asked Melvin Tennant of Meet Minneapolis how it went, what feedback he received from the group, and he sent me an email. I'll just quote him. The LCMS leaders were nothing less than effusive in their praise of their transit experience. They mentioned that Metro Transit has set a very high bar for their next city, Houston. Thank you and your team. That's pretty nice feedback to get, and that's to the credit of many people in this room and many people who are not in this room who do this work every day. I'll mention, I think we're pretty good at big events, and that's because we have people like the awards we gave out today who manage the details and make sure that every detail is considered, that we're adaptable in the process, and it's a pretty enjoyable thing for me to watch as a general manager, take on these events and doing well. In the same vein, I want to thank folks who attended the Orange Line celebration last week. We had a little bit of a technical glitch, and that was when the microphone went out on our chair, and it was a problem that we have a vendor that was providing the audio system, and one of our staff, John Kamerick, had thought to bring an extra mic with a speaker and save the day. So I want to thank John for that. But it was really a nice event, and it had brought a lot of energy again to that. And one of the greatest things I heard over and over again by the local officials was how nice it was to work with such a collaborative staff of the Metro Transit. They talk over and over about the collaborative nature of that relationship, and I think that goes a long way with relationships inside our region. So I wanted to call that out for staff and thank them. Now I'm done.
Right. Any other questions for General Manager Koistra? All right. Thank you very much, and thank you for your report. Now we will move on to our first order of business, which is the consent agenda. There is one item on consent. Can I entertain a motion to approve the consent items?
So moved.
I have a motion. Is there a second? Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Consent agenda is passed. Next, we move on to our non-consent items. The first item is item 2019-178, Southwest LRT Emergency Declaration for Flagging. We have Jim Alexander. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, council members. I'm Jim Alexander, Project Director for the Southwest LRT project. Tonight I have an item 2019-178 that looks to ratify emergency declaration for flagging services on the for the Southwest LRT project to TC&W. They are the local freight rail operator through this corridor, the Bass Lake Spur and the Kenilworth corridor, and the amount is $500,000. And it's essentially a bridge contract to ultimately get a larger contract in the near term to handle the flagging services. So a little background on this is for the construction, the civil construction, we have LMJV, which I've talked about in the past. They are contracted to do the civil work, and part of their responsibility is to provide flagging. And they did have a subcontract with TrackWorks, a company called TrackWorks, to do that flagging. When things got underway in May, there were a couple of incidents about 4 days apart from each other that trains were allowed to go through work areas, both in the Bass Lake Spur and the Kenilworth corridor. And that raised our attention, as well as the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration. Just caught all our eyes looking at the focus of how flagging is done. Flagging is essentially, it's a communication between any construction effort and the railroad as they come through work areas. And it's very important that there's direct communication and clear communication of how those trains progress through the work areas. And so 2 trains were allowed to go through work zones. And so we suspended construction for some time, working with FRA and also working with the contractor to get a better protocol established, just to make sure that we have a safe operation out there. And so we did, there was an emergency declaration that was signed by the regional administrator in the June timeframe, and that allowed work to get underway. And as part of the policy, we look to the council ultimately ratify these emergency declarations. And so this would essentially allows TC&W to do the flagging on an interim basis under that $500,000 contract. We ultimately would look to have a larger contract, and we're currently in negotiations with TC&W to do the flagging long term. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll be glad to take any questions.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Alexander? Councilmember Atlas and Gerritsen.
Were we able to determine how those 2 trains made it through and how we'll ensure that doesn't occur again going forward?
Madam Chair, Councilmember, yes, we were essentially there was a breakdown, if you will, of communication between the flagger and the railroad and the train operator. And so the train operator didn't know the circumstances of the work zone situation, so they ran the train through in both cases in the Kenilworth. I think it happened around the May 13 timeframe and also May 9 on the Bass Lake Spur. I may have those reversed, but in terms of the future, allowing TC&W to have that flagging operations, the TC&W crew that's on the train, that's a direct link, we believe, to provide that clear communication to make sure we have a safe operation.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? All right. Councilmember Zarin.
Does this also shift the responsibility to liability from one entity to the other?
Madam Chair, Council Member, yes, it would shift some liabilities, and we're currently working with TCNW on a long-term contract to address that. We don't. I should back up. We've been working with Phil Walljasper pretty closely on this contract. We don't think that's going to be any more exposure than we already have on the project with TCNW. We have a number of agreements with them currently that handle liability on that piece. So we don't think it's going to be any more exposure than we have today.
And,
Thank you.
and for those of you not on management committee, Phil Walljasper is risk management, and so he kind of oversees all the insurance programs. Any other questions for Mr. Alexander? All right, then I would entertain a motion to approve the business item.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. All right, next we are on to item 2019-184, which is a same week item, Cubic Software Management or Maintenance Agreement Extension. We have Nick Yule.
Good evening, Madam Chair, council members. My name is Nick Yule, and I'm the Senior Manager of Revenue Collections at Metro Transit. My responsibility lies with the fare collection system. And I'm here with business item 2019-184, which, as the chair mentioned, is a same week business item. And the proposed action for this business item is that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to execute a sole source fare collection software support agreement extension with Cubic Transportation Systems, otherwise known as Cubic, for 2 years with 2 additional 1-year options, so up to 4 years total, at a maximum cost of $2.4 million. And a little bit of background on this, Cubic is the company that designed and implemented our fare collection system, the go-to-cart system, as you may be familiar. And that system is responsible for about 60% of all of Metro Transit rides, and is actually much higher on the suburban transit providers. About 90% of rides are taken using a go-to-cart. Cubic continues to provide software and hardware maintenance and support for this system, such as providing resources for upgrades and ongoing maintenance, troubleshooting issues, and any consultation that we need on any new system features or capabilities. Because Cubic owns the intellectual property to their hardware and software, we get all of our hardware and software from Cubic on this system. This is a sole source contract. There are no other companies that can provide the level of support that we need for this system. We've analyzed this cost of the cost of this potential 4-year agreement against what other agencies are paying for similar support, as well as what we've paid for past agreements, and we found this cost to be fair and reasonable. Funding for these costs have been included in the 2019 Metropolitan Council operating budget, as well as for future years. I appreciate your time, and I'll take any questions you have.
Any questions from council members? Councilmember Chambliss.
I'm just curious about why it's a same week request and not sooner.
Madam Chair, council member, we've been waiting for information on Cubic for quite some time, and actually we would have been prepared for the July 8th meeting, but that meeting were canceled. This contract expires on July 31st, so the hope is to get something executed before that expiration.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
I'm just curious about what, when we're looking at the Thrive lens on projects like this, how does equity come into play? I understand about the service aspect of it. It enables people to use our system, improvements there from across all communities. But I'm curious about for a vendor, how do we look at them as a employer and what their employment practices are and how they fit into our.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember, I can speak to that part a little bit. I know through the procurement process, there are stringent requirements about, and I can't speak to the specifics on this, but there are documents that Cubic needs to provide us anytime we sign a contract, certainly one of this size, where they have equal opportunity practices and hiring practices that are consistent with council requirements. And again, I can't speak specifically to what those are, but I know as part of this process, our procurements department has been working with Cubic to make sure that they're providing all the documentation and meet our requirements. From an equity perspective in general, just as an example of how this system helps facilitate this, if you're not familiar with our low-income program, it's called TAP, the Transit Assistance Program, and this is one of the mechanisms that allows us to provide that program for those discounted rides through the go-to card. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Thank you. I think it'd be nice to see each aspect of the Thrive lens spoken to directly in this format. For these types of reports when we're not getting a presentation and this is the only document we see. So we have those 5 aspects that make up the lens, and it'd be nice to see each of those either addressed, or if it's not applicable, saying it's not applicable in this context, just so that we're looking at apples and zebras and oranges and zucchini sometimes there.
The point is well taken. I think that we can certainly do that. I think over my expectation, because some of these things become very contracts and numbers and nuts and bolts, that definitely as we do have our staff do that and bring that out, please comment on what you're seeing, if it's getting the information that you want. And I'm sure that General Manager and Director Thompson will work with their people with that too, but some feedback on it would be helpful as we do that. All right. With that, is there any other questions for Mr. Hill? All right. If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve the business item.
So moved.
The motion, is there a second?
Seconded.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And the motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Next, we are on to item 2019-193, Metro Mobility Demand East Zone. We have Christine Coonan. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christine Kennan. I'm the Senior Manager of Metro Mobility, and I'm here to present business item 2019-193. This is a proposed action to authorize the regional administrator to exercise the previously authorized optional year 6 in the Metro Mobility Demand East Zone contract with First Transit and increase the maximum contract amount by an amount not to exceed $24,395,837. This is because the original contract authorization was fully funded for 5 years, not the optional 6. As background for you, in February 2015, the Metropolitan Council approved the action to authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute contract 14P109 with First Transit for the Metro East Zone for a 5-year term from August 30th, 2015 to August 30th, 2020, with an option for 1 additional year in an amount not to exceed $85,945,267. The Council later approved an additional spending authorization in July 2016, increasing the maximum amount to $88,393,267 as part of an approved increase to the minimum driver wage rate that had been originally set. Sufficient funds remain in the existing authorization to provide services through year 5 of the contract. The Metro Mobility Service Area has 3 geographic zones, Metro West, Metro East, and Metro South, that are served by 3 trip providers under separate contracts. So we are just talking about the one for Metro East with the additional contract authorization. Each of these contracts was initiated in 2015 with a 5-year term and an option to extend by 1 year. Annually, over 2.3 million rides are delivered under these contracts. In order to best manage the procurement and service transition for our 3 large service contracts, Metro Mobility plans to stagger the termination of each of the current contracts and issue requests for proposals for our next service contracts to begin on a staggered implementation schedule. So the Metro South would end existing contract at the close of this current 5-year term in June 30th of 2020. Metro West would extend the existing contract to June 30th of 2021, exercising optional year 6. And Metro East, the subject of this business item, will extend the existing contract to August 31st, 2021, exercising that optional year 6. And then there is a map of the service zones. We are not changing the structure of the service zones. Those were restructured 5 years ago, and the geographical separation is performing well for us. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Councilmember Sterner.
Well, thank you, Chair. I just had a question looking at the south zone coming up, and now Lakeville's been recently through legislation being offered. Would that automatically come into the south zone, or you have to do some extra maneuvering to get Lakeville?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Council Member. I will need to submit a contract amendment authorization to add Lakeville as a city to be served by the Demand South Zone, but the language of the current contract would allow me to easily do that, and there is existing authorization and spending we forecasted out to account for 20 rides in 2020 under that contract, so I won't need to approach for additional spending for that contract.
All right, thank you.
All right. Any other additional questions? All right. If not, I would entertain a motion to approve the business item.
Motion to approve.
I have a motion. Is there a second?
Second?
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Thanks, Christine. Next, we are on to a 2019 budget item or budget amendment. It's the 2019-187 joint item. We have Ed Petrie and Heather Augustin-Huebner here. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair, committee members. Ed Petrie, Director of Finance, Metro Transit.
And Heather Augustin-Huebner, Director of Finance, MTS.
And Heather and I have a couple items on the agenda this evening. The first item will be the second quarter capital amendment that we will go through. As I go through the amendment, I will go through the information for Metro Transit first. I'll go through all the capital information, take questions, and move on to the operating piece for Metro Transit. Then I will turn it over to Heather, and she will follow the same on Metropolitan Transportation Services. One of the things that we both want to let you know with this amendment this evening, this is generally one of our largest amendments of the year. As you are aware, with the legislative session this past year, we received our Regional Transit Capital Authority from the legislature. We had the federal funds available for this fiscal year. The RTC money, the Regional Transit Capital money, now came in from the legislature, was appropriated by the legislature and approved as of July 1st, 2019. We use those funds, those local funds, to match our federal money to apply for our federal grants. So generally, every year after the RTC money is available from the legislature, we bring in our big amendment. So when the council adopts the CIP, the council adopted the CIP, our capital improvement plan, back in December of 2018, or calendar year 2019. With the CIP, we have all the items that we anticipated within the 2019 budget that we had planned for pending receipt of the funds. So now the funds are now available. So tonight is the heavy lift. Now bringing a lot of those projects out of the CIP, bringing them forward into the capital plan as funding is available. So with that, I will go through a lot of the items on Metro Transit. There's a number of real small capital items. So what I'll do is I'll hit a lot of the large ones and explain stuff on the operating and then open up for any questions that you may have. With the spreadsheet, first of all, the spreadsheet that you have on screen, it's a very large spreadsheet, a lot of projects. The sections for Metro Transit include administrative adjustments, projects that we're closing, and then the meat of the adjustment is the authorizing of the new projects, increasing authorization as the funding is available. And I will address those changes as we go. On the administrative adjustment, there's a few different adjustments on that. The largest one is a $4.5 million adjustment. It's money going between the C line and the D line. The C line and the D line projects are projects that have similar scope, same type of scope within the federal grant. With the C line project, the C line came in with favorable bids on a number of their projects, on a number of their construction projects, had funds left over. So the D line is a positive recipient of those funds. So with the administrative amendment, it's within the scope of the federal grant. We're then going to transfer $3.6 million of federal funds and the associated $900,000 of RTC match from the C line over to the D line. Closing of projects, which is the center section, we have a number of projects that have completed within the Metro Transit scope. So what happens is when the council authorizes projects,
I'm going to pause you. I think we have a question. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
I just think did I mishear you that we have a spreadsheet that you're referring to?
You would, Madam Chair, committee members, you would have a spreadsheet. You should have it as attached to the business item.
I can't find it. I'll figure it out.
On your screen.
All right, well, I'll get it. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay.
I'm good. I'm with you now.
It's a multicolored, a lot of orange, a lot of...
I was pressing on the wrong budget amendment.
We ready to go?
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Like I mentioned, we have a number of projects right in the middle that when the council authorizes projects, project managers, project staff will go through and they'll complete the projects. within the available scope of the projects, within the available scope of the money. When projects are then completed, if there's any balance of funds left, we will then close the projects to get those projects off the books. If there's any balance of money, then we will then bring that money back into the Metro Transit capital program to be reallocated into future projects then. So we have a number of projects that we are closing, probably about 12 to 15 projects with about $1.2 million worth of funds, mainly RTC funds, local money that will then go back into our program, will then start getting allocated down below on the next section. The meat of the amendment for Metro Transit is we are bringing in a total of just over $68 million worth of projects, recommending for adoption this evening or bringing forward this evening. Projects that were in our council adopted CIP program. Money is now available. We're going to bring those projects forward this evening. Some of the big projects include the tire lease, bringing in about $2.2 million of federal funds and $549,000 in operating match funds. This is for the tire lease for the tires on the Metro Transit bus fleet. On the D line, we have a couple projects or a couple adjustments to the D-line project. First of all, we're returning $3.17 million worth of RTC funds back into the Metro Transit capital program. Previous amendment, with the first quarter amendment, when we came forward, we actually encumbered $3.17 million of the money for the D-line project so they could begin design and engineering work. At that same time, we were applying for the federal grant. But because of what was happening in Washington, there was a delay in the authorization of the federal grant. That federal grant has now been awarded. It's been authorized. Wes has signed it, and the money is now available. So we're now going to release the encumbrance of the $3.17 million, and the federal money is now available for the D line, which is the next adjustment for the D line. It's recognizing $9.5 million in federal money and $2.3 million of RTC match, which will be used for the design activities and station construction along the D line. Our B line project, the amendment would recognize $1.3 million in federal funds and $640,000 in RTC funds to be used for some advanced construction development, engineering, and for staff time. Another one of our major projects that you're noting this evening is a blue line option notes payable adjustment. Way back a couple years ago, the council negotiated an interest-free 5-year loan with CTIP, the County's Transit Improvement Board, to purchase 5 blue line vehicles. These vehicles then were payable back to the CTIP, which is now Hennepin County, taking it over, payable back to the CTIP at $2.8 million a year for 5 years, interest-free. So this is then setting up the installment number 4 for $2.8 million. The final installment will be due next June 30th of 2024, $2.8 million. So that was one thing we were very happy to get, an interest-free note payable from CTIP.
Quick question, Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Ed?
Yes.
I am curious, I know we're kind of in the middle of this process right now, but I'm curious, how did you make the decisions to come up with these new projects? What's the process for deciding on these specific projects, and which items didn't make it on the list?
Okay, Madam Chair, committee members, very good question. When we establish our projects for the year, for example, for 2019, we sit with all the project managers and identify what the timing of the projects are. So we have a very good idea which projects are slated for first, second, third, and fourth quarter. And what we do then is, before every budget amendment, we will then do a full call to all project managers. And we'll give them the balance of the projects. For example, for this amendment, we gave them the list of balance of the projects listed for second quarter, and then the third and fourth quarter projects has said, which of these projects are you project managers ready to go with?
Okay.
So then we met with all the project managers, we met with Wes, and based on the projects that were ready to go, determined which ones were ready to go. The balance for the projects that didn't get ready, that aren't on this evening, that were on the 2019 CIP are still in queue, ready to go once the project manager is ready to go. We have the funding available. We're just ready for the project manager to bring it forward and say, we are ready to, it's shovel ready to go.
And then as council members, we will vote on the capital improvement program at the end of the year. So all of what they are doing is fed by what we approve.
Madam.
Yes.
Yeah, I just think it is important to clarify, and Ed, certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but the application of the funds to specific projects, as you said, is based on readiness. And I think what you're trying to clarify, I want to emphasize at the end, it's not at the cost of other projects. Those other projects are still going to be funded. It's just the movement of this money at this particular time to projects that are ready.
Okay.
And thank you, Mr. Cloister, that is totally correct. And one other thing I will also add, committee members, is once we bring forward the final capital amendment of the year, there will still be a handful of projects that did not move forward in 2019. What we will then do is we will then sit down with those project managers and say, this is a project that you had planned for in 2019. Do you want to move this forward now into 2020? The money is here. So that's one of the things. None of the projects this evening are at the expense of another project. It's just based on pure timing, when shovel ready, when they're ready to go.
Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, members, also, as you'll get to the MTS section, you'll see a lot of buses and repairs, and that's driven by a fleet replacement policy that guides when we replace a bus or when we expand a new service. So there's these policies upstream that you're seeing that are leading to some of these investments that you're seeing before you, in addition to the CIP. So, for example, a bus is replaced every 14 years, and so that's how the buses you see in here for express services are 14 years old and are being replaced. But that's driven by our regional fleet policy, for example. So there's policies like that that lead to projects.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions while we're paused here? All right.
And I'd like to thank Mr. Thompson. He set me up for my next project. The next project I'd like to talk about is bus replacement 2020 for Metro Transit. This amendment will recognize $19.9 million in federal funding, $7.2 million in MVEST, and $3.1 million in RTC funding to replace the planned replacement of 27 60-foot buses from Metro Transit. It'll replace it with 13 60-foot electric buses and 14 60-foot standard diesel buses. We also have buses for the D-line. This amendment would recognize $10.8 million in CMAQ formula funds and $2.2 million in RTC funds to purchase 14 60-foot arterial BRT diesel buses for the D-line. And those are the major projects for Metro Transit. Chair, committee members, as I stated, this amendment would bring in just over $68 million worth of projects that were planned within our CIP. Funding is available. We would bring it into our authorized capital program. And with that, Chair and committee members, I would stand for question. Any more other questions on the capital? And then I would move on to operating.
Any questions from council members? All right, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair, committee members. The next portion is the operating portion for Metro Transit. Let me page back to that here. We have three different items that we're recommending on the operating portion. First of all, our first item is a $20,000 grant. It was a competitive grant that we were able to obtain for the 2019 Operation Lifesaver Rail Safety Education Grant to provide some rail safety education. It was a $20,000 federal grant that we were awarded. The next item is an adjustment. It's recognizing $10 million. It's a swap between the capital and the operating programs. This is an adjustment that we periodically will make during the year. It's moving $10 million worth of motor vehicle sales tax funds down to our capital program, and then moving the same amount of $10 million worth of federal funds from our capital program up into operations to be used for preventive maintenance activities. It's a zero change, zero adjustment. It has no impact on our operating budget, no impact on the capital budget. It'll still maintain all of our assets in a state of good repair. One of the reasons that we do this is that it allows us to have a little more flexibility with some of our smaller projects, because a lot of our smaller projects are either sole source or they're smaller vendors that have more of a difficult time working within federal guidelines. And also with the federal process, a lot of our smaller projects are projects that need to move a lot faster than what it takes to apply for the federal grant and wait 90 to 120 days to get the grant to move forward. So this offers us flexibility within our capital program. The other item is an adjustment that is the result of the legislative session this past year, of which when Heather and I get into the budget amendment, we'll talk very extensively about this. It's an adjustment on state appropriations. It's reducing the Metro Transit bus state appropriations by $5,837,700. And it's increasing the state appropriations for Metro Mobility, which is from the 2019 legislative session. One of the things that happened with the legislative session this year is that the legislature took the state appropriation dollars, which used to be stated just for transit operations. They now broke them into two pots of dollars, one for Metro Mobility and one for transit operations, which is for light rail and commuter rail. When we get into the budget presentation, I actually have a chart that we'll go through, but basically what it did was any state appropriation dollars for bus operations is no longer there. State appropriations are now for metro mobility and for the transit operations, which will be consumed by light rail and commuter rail. So within our multi-year forecast and as a result of legislation, it's taking the $5.8 million with state appropriations out of bus operations, and we are going to then use $5.8 million worth of planned use of reserves in place of it. And as I stated, Chair, we will go into a lot more detail when I get into the operating budget on that information. With our Chair and committee members, that is the operating adjustments for Metro Transit. I would stand for any questions.
All right, any questions so far? All right, move on to Heather.
Okay, Madam Chair, committee members, I will take the same general approach that Ed did. I will walk through the MTS capital budget, do a pause, and then transition to the operating budget. MTS is requesting to bring in $14.2 million into the authorized capital program. All individual projects are detailed at the individual level in the business item, and I'll call out those of significant note. The first section that I'll always call out for you are any projects that we're putting forth that are not in the adopted CIP, and that would be the CIP that the council has adopted the previous year. Tonight, we have 8 projects that fit into this category. 6 of the projects are for buses and related technology where the buses were totaled and need to be replaced to maintain current service levels. Buses will be funded by RTC and insurance proceeds. The remaining 2 projects are to purchase 9 buses and related technology for Metro Mobility expansion service to Lakeville. This expansion was directed in the most recent legislative session. You'll hear more about the operating impacts of the expansion later tonight in our operating budget presentation. The second is that the council historically brings in suburban transit provider federal formula earnings in the form of RTC into the authorized capital program once funds become available. These funds are placed in an undesignated project and then moved to specific projects as suburban providers identify them. We do this so their projects aren't delayed by our administrative processes. This amendment authorizes just over $2.8 million for future Maple Grove, MBTA, Plymouth, and Southwest Transit capital projects. Funds will be passed through using grant agreements, and you will see specific projects in future administrative adjustments. Our remaining capital ask involved bringing forward awarded federal funding and some RTC for planned bus replacements, midlife bus rehabs, and engine and transmission rehabs. All of these projects are in the approved capital improvement plan, or CIP. I will take a pause there and answer any questions you may have on the capital side.
All right, any questions so far? All right, good.
Okay. On the administrative adjustments, and I'm sorry, I probably should have looped these 2 together instead of looping this with our operation side. But most of our budgets routinely include administrative adjustments, and I'll make sure to call those out of regional significance or those with a high dollar value. As a reminder, these are adjustments where the council has awarded budget authority to a parent category, such as big bus or small bus, and we have made adjustments within that. So if you award money for a small bus, and one project is $100,000 less, we'll just reallocate that $100,000 to another small bus. So there's never going to be a case where you approve money for small bus and then we decide to use it for technology or something completely unrelated. So tonight's administrative adjustments can be broken into 2 primary categories, the first of which is bus buys. We brought in RTC budget authority for bus buys in a 2018 quarterly amendment and are now programming those dollars for specific buys. This includes replacement buses and related technology, all of which are in the CIP for suburban transit providers, MTS contracted fixed route, Metro Mobility, and Transit Link. We are also making some minor adjustments in funding sources to spend down federal grants as quickly as possible, and this is at the general request of the FTA. I guess I'm going to end up pausing a second time before going into the operating budget, if anybody has any questions.
All right, any questions? All right, keep going.
All right. So on the operating side, this amendment will take 3 primary actions. First, it will increase state appropriations for Metro Mobility by $11,585,000. This adjustment will reflect the legislative base appropriation and one-time increase for Metro Mobility to a state fiscal year 2020 total of just over $80 million and an increase in calendar year 2019 from $64.7 million to a total of $76.3 million. And as Ed mentioned earlier, we'll be getting into this in a lot more detail with the 2020 operating budget presentation. We'll talk more about specific legislative outcomes on the Metro Mobility tonight and in future meetings. Second, this amendment authorizes $580,000 in MBEST revenues to be transferred from contracted services to the operating budget to the capital program, and for $580,000 of federal funds to be transferred from the capital budget to the operating. So this is very similar to what Ed just walked through. We are moving dollar for dollar an equal amount of funds from the operating to the capital side. Lastly, this amendment will recognize $100,000 in direct state appropriation for MBTA's Route 495, and those funds will be passed through with an agreement. The proposed amendment programs, in summary, the proposed amendment programs available federal, state, other, and regional funds to the unified budget to allow the council to carry out our work plan and long-term capital program. The budget amendment demonstrates commitment towards asset management, preservation, and also supports the Thrive outcomes of stewardship by assessing future needs, responsible planning, and management of resources for Metro Transit and Metropolitan Transportation Services. The budget amendment adds funding for the D line and reflects strategic investment in regional infrastructure that will promote economic competitiveness and create prosperity for the region. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions you may have.
All right, any questions for the presenters? All right, then I would entertain a motion to approve the budget amendment.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? Councilmember Atlas Goodson.
I wanted to point out in this report, the Thrive Lens section is sectioned out in the way I am talking about. It doesn't include all 5 of the lenses, but it includes 2 and then bullets underneath them, how this particular item addresses it. That's exactly what I'm talking about, so we don't need to follow up about it afterwards, but just in that manner. Then it's really clear and we're not inferring what staff is meaning and being specific.
Perfect, that helps, and a testament to our very detail-oriented budget people. So
Thank
I
you.
would say. All right, so I guess any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed nay, and the motion carries. So our next order of business is to actually decide what goes on the consent agenda. The budget amendment will not. Number 3, the Metro Mobility, I think could go not on consent, where the other 2 items could go on consent. Oh, no, number 2 is the same week item. So just number 1. Any concerns? Okay. All right. All right, so next we're moving on to the budget presentation. Just going to introduce this a little bit myself because this is for all the rest of you, the first time going through the budget process, and this will be something that we do every year, and it kicks off about now. It's a really important step today for the budget process. You all received the slides on Friday afternoon. I did have a chance to walk through them with Heather and Ed and the general manager and MTS director. As you go through this, it can get kind of complicated. It's a lot to cover in a short time period. Definitely ask questions, and if you want to reach out and have any individual briefings or that type of thing, just let me know or let any of our staff here know, and we can get that arranged. Our budget will go through each of everyone has a division budget, so this is just for MTS and Metro Transit tonight, and then ultimately it'll go to the regional administrator who will prepare a budget for council approval, and that will be sort of the next step coming from that. But like you said, today it's the chance for MTS and Metro Transit to walk through their items. Because this is the first time seeing this, I encourage staff to add some extra information in here. So it may be a long presentation, but should be helpful, I think, in the long run. I think you will see very, very clearly how the balance that we have to walk through with fiscal constraints and how the effect of some of the unpredictable nature of some of our funding sources. And so as you see some of those things, if you have questions, I think it's really key and really important to focus on some of those items because it really has long-term implications of how we look at and address our operating budget. And like I said, I definitely ask questions. If you want more detail, just let any of us know. We'll make sure you get that opportunity. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ed and Heather to talk about the 2020 operating budget.
Thank you, Chair, committee members. Once again, Ed Petrie, Heather Augustin, we're here to present the 2020 operating budget. As the Chair mentioned, this will probably be a long presentation, so I apologize ahead of time. If there's any time you want us to speed up, just please let us know. But we have a lot of detail, a lot of data to go through, and we're open to questions. We may not have the answers when you ask the questions, but we'll do our best. But it is a lot of data that we're going to be going through this evening. So with that, we will move forward. Okay, it's not moving.
It may be a very short presentation.
Yes, it may be very short. Using the arrow keys and nothing is working. He's moving it right now for me? Yeah. So I just announce next? Okay. We'll improvise. Okay. First, I always want to walk through just a quick schedule so you're aware of what's going to be happening with the budgets for this coming year. During the July-August time period, we'll be coming before the council just to do some preliminary budget review, informational meetings. What you're reviewing this evening is just an information item. You're not taking action on it. It's moving. Okay. And we will then come back to the council, I believe it is on October 14th, to do another informational item, which would be a full consolidated presentation. And then the council will then act on October 28th to set the levies, where the council will then set the maximum levies for the region. During the September and October timeline, we will then come back. And as the chair had mentioned also too, we will be doing we'll do some work on the 6-year CIP, the 2020 budget and the 2020 through 2025 CIP capital improvement plan. Heather and I will be back to do another tag team and go over that capital information with you folks, with the full council members. October 23rd, we will then send out for public comment, the public comment drafts, which would include the operating budget, levies, and the capital information. That goes out for the public comment period. Then we will then come back to the council on December 11th, review any information we'd received during the public comment period. Also review any information at that time that has changed in the budget. One of the things that I'll say right up front that will probably change within the budget is the budget information that you're looking at this evening. We receive our motor vehicle sales tax, which I'll go into more detail in the budget, but we receive our motor vehicle sales tax forecast twice a year, once in February and once in November. So the budget information that we're going to review this evening is based upon the February 2019 motor vehicle sales tax forecast from the state of Minnesota. Prior to council adoption in December, we will receive the November 2019 motor vehicle sales tax. Knock on wood, there's no changes, but any changes that motor vehicle sales tax would reflect, we will then reflect before we recommend adopting the budget then in December. So we will come to the council members, come to the council and let them know this was previous forecast, new forecast, the change, and this is where the recommended changes would go within the operating budgets. Oh, it's working great. We're in business time. Some of the items that we want to go into a little more detail is the basis for the budget development. We want to discuss, first of all, the Minnesota statutes with the role of the regional administrator with the budget, the Metropolitan Council policy and actions and their impact on the budget process, the Minnesota legislative actions that have just taken place and how that impacts the budget, And also then we also do a multi-year financial outlook for transit, which also has some impacts on the budget and the use of reserves. All that is built into what we'll be discussing this evening. Once I stated also the preliminary budgets that are being brought to you that reflect the legislative session, current law state appropriations, and the February 2019 motor vehicle sales tax forecast. And as I stated, we will then come back after the November forecast comes in prior to adoption, then recommend any changes that does impact the budget as a result of motor vehicle sales tax changes. First, I do want to talk about the basis for the budget development, which is the regional administrator. Per Minnesota Statute 473.125, the regional administrator shall recommend to the council for adoption measures deemed necessary for efficient administration of the council, keep the council fully apprised of the financial condition of the council, and prepare and submit an annual budget to the council for approval. As the chair mentioned earlier, the budget that we're presenting this evening will become part of the regional administrator's budget that will then be brought forward to the council for approval. Metropolitan Council policy and actions on the development for the basis for the development of the budget. There's a few things I do want to review that the input that the council has in the development of the budget. We realize also that, a lot of these things have happened prior to you starting within the Metropolitan Council, but the tenure of the council does continue. So I just wanted to go over some of the items, some of the things that have impacted or do place some impacts on our budget. One of the main things within the budget is our service plan. For example, Metro Transit, our service plan, which is our plan for service on the street, which controls our operators, mechanics, fuel, and parts. For example, for the Metro Transit bus operations, that accounts for about 65% of our budget. So the service piece, our service on the street, is a large portion of our budget. That is driven by the TPP transportation policy plan. As you're aware, the council or the old regional transit services are evaluated under the transportation policy plan, and this includes all regional services, including the Metropolitan Council services and the suburban transit providers. All routes are evaluated on an annual basis for potential changes, and or including any type of changes and or elimination based upon service standards within the transportation policy plan. In addition, we also do a regional route analysis that's performed and reviewed on an annualized basis, all based upon the parameters of the transportation policy plan with standards that are set by the council. So I just want to I'm just trying to set forward that our service plan is vetted and set by the standards set forth in the transportation policy plan. In addition, another item is labor agreements. The council, our transportation division, has a number of labor agreements, which include ATU, which would be Local 1005, which operate our trains and our buses. TMSA, we have the LES, which is the police. We have ASME, we have non-REMS. These are all labor agreements that all the parameters are brought forward to the council, adopted by the council as far as what the wage increases would be, health insurance, those types of items. All of those parameters, which have previously been adopted by the council and approved by the council in these multi-year labor contracts, are now part of the budget this evening. Another item that the council previous council has done a lot of work on is with our fare policy. And as you recall, also our last fare increase was in October of 2017, where the council was very involved, where we actually set the regional fares across the region. So we just want to point out that the council, you established the regional fare policy, and helped to establish our fares.
General Manager Koister.
I just wanted to mention there was in the 2017 fare changes that we introduced the TAP program.
That's correct.
At that point. So the fare policy discussions are very important at the council in terms of the ability to establish both the standard fare policy and in this case we established the exception for TAP
brand new
eligible.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So how often is the fare policy reviewed? How frequently?
General Manager Koister.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cummings, that's a really good question. I think the fare policy, sometimes, I'll give you my history as regional administrator and so forth, it gets raised as a policy question from an operations standpoint as we're dealing with challenges, budget challenges and so forth periodically, but it's really up to the chair and the council when they want to to address fare policy in a more comprehensive way, or in a way that looks at changes. And I think that ability is available to the council at any time to take a closer look at fare policy and to consider what changes they might want to make.
Thank you.
And just a general comment, I think that was, the prior council had started down that path with a hope that sort of evaluating that policy on an ongoing basis would be carried on by this current council.
Madam Chair, one more comment is I believe it had been 8 years before that the last fare policy change was made, before 2017. I think we would recommend that it be looked at on a more frequent basis than every 8 years, but it's a heavy lift from a lot of directions. In terms of there's always winners and losers in fare policy changes.
Thank you.
And Chair and committee members, one thing I'd like to add is that with our fare, we have a regional fare policy. All of our fares impact both bus, regional bus, including Metro Mobility, all of our contracted services, the suburban transit providers, and also in addition, all the light rail and commuter rail service. We have transfer reciprocity, and it's a regional fare system across all modes. The other item that the council has some input on, is with our target fund balance. The council has policy 3-8, which is our target fund balance policy, which promotes financial management within the council. And the council has established target fund balances for each one of the operating units, and we'll go through that in more detail when we get into the transit units. But the fund balances help each operating unit to meet cash flow needs and ensure adequate protection for unanticipated events. Forecasts and legislation, as we've been kind of talking about earlier. The budget this evening has been reviewed with all of our state forecasts and with all of our internal financial plans. We do multiple financial plans here at the council, multiple forecasts. We do multiple financial plans for the FDA, for example, like our submittals for Southwest, all those types of items. We make sure first of all, we make sure that all of our plans are talking the same language. That one set of assumptions is consistent within all of our plans. Few things that happened with the legislative session this past year is, first of all, with state appropriations. As we discussed, the Minnesota legislature took the transit system state appropriations and divided it into two groups, one for Metro Mobility and then one for transit systems, which would include light rail and commuter rail. And then one of the things I do want to point out is with that discussion, with that breakout for the Metro Mobility, we view that as a very positive. Is the fact that Metro Mobility which Heather will talk about in her slides. Metro Mobility is a division that's growing. The service is growing at a higher than our standard 3.15% growth. So we look at the view that the legislature is breaking out Metro Mobility as its own state appropriation as a positive for the council, that the legislature is recognizing it as a federally mandated service and recognizing the importance of Metro Mobility. So that will then allow us in future legislative sessions to go back and hopefully ask for continued funding, which we'll talk about in the state appropriation slide. Another thing is we have, losing my point here. One of the things that we also do within our forecast and our legislation is we continually do a continual financial outlook, where we'll actually do a financial outlook. We'll actually look at current year operations and look at operations based on current state law for motor vehicle sales tax or state appropriations, and we'll forecast for the next 4 years. And we'll actually then forecast everything out and look under state law, current contracts, current labor contracts, current service plans, how our financial outlook looks for the next few years. I guess I'll go on to the next one. Let's just move into some of the meat of the detail for some of the items. State appropriations. State appropriations are appropriated by the legislature on a biennial basis. Per existing legislation right now, the state appropriations must cover 50% of the net operating subsidy for light rail, but does exclude the Metro Green Line extension. That is exclusion within legislation. Today, the state appropriations are consumed entirely by the light rail, commuter rail, and Metro Mobility operations. There are no, as a result, you saw with the amendment that we took this evening, operating amendment, there are no state operations going to bus operations. Bus operations today now is fully funded and totally reliant upon motor vehicle sales tax and passenger fares. We'll talk about motor vehicle sales tax in a few moments, but one of the challenges with that, and which our chairs also alluded to, is the fact that motor vehicle sales tax is a very volatile revenue source. And I do have some charts to show you, some information to share with you on some of the concerns we have with that funding source for bus operations. With the both growth in metro mobility and with rail operations, the current levels of state general fund appropriations will not be enough. And with the current growth in Metro Mobility is forecasted as of this point in time to consume by state fiscal year 2022, 100% of the state appropriation, which would then leave nothing left then for the bus operation or for the rail operation side, nothing left for bus operation side. Everything else will then have to go fall onto motor vehicle sales tax if there is not an increase in state appropriations from the legislature. And do have a chart that will follow in just another moment. I guess this slide just talks about just the breakout of state funding into two separate appropriations: transit operations, metro mobility, and recognition of the federally mandated service. But let's just move right onto the chart. This pretty well tells the story for the state appropriations. This is broken out between state fiscal years 2020 through 2023. You see it's broken out between metro mobility, light rail, commuter rail, and bus operations. And within each one of the line, we do have what the base appropriation is and what one-time funding is. As you will note, with the base appropriation, we have base appropriations in metro mobility at $57.17 million in state fiscal year 2020, just over $25 million for light rail, $7 million for commuter rail, nothing for base operations for bus. You will also note within this slide, we do have one-time funding for state appropriations of $23 million for state fiscal year 2020. As you recall, Metro Mobility, and besides the legislature breaking out Metro Mobility and the transit operations, light rail, commuter rail, Metro Mobility also received one-time funding of $23 million in state fiscal year 2020 and a proposed $13 million in state fiscal year 2021. One of the things I do want to point out with state funding is, or with one-time funding is, this is one of the challenges that we have had with state appropriations with the legislature. The previous biennial sessions, biennial 2018-2019, as a result of forecasted deficits within our transit operations, the council received a one-time $70 million one-time funds, $30 million for state fiscal year 18, $40 million for state fiscal year 19 within our transit operations. That was one-time money. State fiscal year 2020 was gone. We went back down to our base of $89 million. Once again, we have received $23 million of one-time money for Metro Mobility and a proposed another $13 million, totaling $36 million this state legislative session. Starting in 2022, those funds are gone. So then we'll be back to our base of $88 to $89 million.
Okay. General Manager Koistra.
Manager, Ed just covered what I was going to say, that well, as we keep receiving one-time money for long-term issues, we keep facing a fiscal cliff. So if people ask you, why do we continuously face a fiscal cliff? It's because we get one-time money for ongoing deficits, and it just moves it out a couple of years every time this happens.
Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, members, I'd point out to line 1 on here, the base for Metro Mobility. The one service that is growing faster than any in terms of budget increase percentage is Metro Mobility, and you see a declining base. And that is a mandatory service, so it highlights that, this reliability of it. We're going to have to ask for one time again, or if we don't get a permanent, because of that declining base.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there was conversation in earlier meetings about data sharing that might result in federal funding that could go toward Metro Mobility, if I'm not mistaken, and where we stand with that.
Madam Chair, members, because we have, that'll be coming up later in the presentation, but we aren't able to count on that yet in the budget. And we anticipate $8 million or so that potential to save, reduction in cost, but until we are certain of that, we can't build that into the budget. We've already started to work with DHS, and we're working on that data sharing element to figure out if it's what the magnitude would be when it's possible, and so that we now have authority to work with DHS, and we've started that. We haven't recognized any savings from it yet.
Right, quick follow. And that $8 million would be not one time, that would be ongoing year to year, or that's the hope or the expectation?
Madam Chair, yes, so what that is, our hope is that it would be a sustainable source of, basically we'd be able to bring in some federal funds that we're not now, that, and provide the same service.
Thank you.
Right. Any other questions? We'll give a pause. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair and committee members, one of the things within a couple slides coming up, I do have some slides on our financial outlook, our multi-year financial outlook, which will then layer in the state general fund appropriation, the one-time funds, and you will see the impacts, what that has on us from state fiscal year 2019 through 2023, with the use of state funds, and with the state funds disappearing, with the one-time funds disappearing, what happens to us with our financial outlook. So I'm just kind of previewing what will be coming forward in a couple of minutes. So motor vehicle sales tax, the next item, motor vehicle sales tax. As I mentioned earlier, motor vehicle sales taxes are forecasted by the state of Minnesota every February and every November. The budget this evening is based upon the February 2019 forecast. We'll receive a new forecast in November. We will then make any recommended changes prior to adoption in December. Currently, the council budgets, due to the volatility of motor vehicle sales tax, the council budgets 95% of the state forecast. We use that as a conservative measure because historically we've had many years where we've collected 95, 96, 97% of forecast. So as a result, we've taken the conservative measure where we only budget 95%. Any collections in excess of 95% are then put into a motor vehicle sales tax reserve and are then available for future year budget operations. One of the things, though, with the motor vehicle sales tax, is a very volatile revenue source, and we'll get into that. This slide will show that, but then the next slide will really show what we're talking about with the motor vehicle sales tax. This slide has a lot of that data on it. It goes from state fiscal year 2016. There's the forecasted state fiscal year 2023. You'll notice that every state fiscal year comes in February and November. The ones to really look at that I really want to focus on, which we'll also focus on the next slide, is the red dots, which is February 2017, and then the peach dots, November of 2017. You will notice the red hash marks significantly higher. All of a sudden, at the end of the year, between February and November, our forecast dropped by over $111 million. That's one of the challenges that we historically have faced with motor vehicle sales tax, because it drops that fast, and you have to be able to react to it, which is one of the reasons why the council only budgets 95% for motor vehicle sales tax. You'll notice in November 18, you have a question?
Councilmember Sterner.
Well, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just had a question because I know we had a problem with the system with the state where it wasn't like collecting or they're under reporting. I'm just wondering if that's been solved and maybe that was part of the issue of the big gap in the volatility of things.
Chair, committee members, that has been solved. That was not the cause for the gap. Any of those receipts we have collected, that was not the cause for the drop.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Good question. One of the things you will notice, November 18, the forecast came back up a little bit. February 2019, the forecast came up a little bit again. It came up about $59 million between November of 18 and February of 2019. But one of the things, let's look at the next chart. This is the chart that really shows what happened. You can see, going back to November 15th, every 6-month period, the motor vehicle sales tax forecast kept dropping, kept dropping, kept dropping. All of a sudden, between February of 17 and November 17, it dropped to $111 million. That is one of the things that within our whole budget, that's one of the things that really concerns me, is the fact is that we're very reliant, our bus operations are very reliant on motor vehicle sales tax. As we have stated, as of state fiscal year 2022, Metro Mobility will consume 100% of the state general fund. If we receive no additional state general fund, then light rail operations, commuter rail operations will then have to convert over to motor vehicle sales tax and be using funds that right now are being used by bus operations.
General Manager question.
I want to emphasize that this volatility is happening during economic growth. And for those of us who were here during the recession, you saw one line lower than the other line, lower than the other line. Every forecast kept coming in lower and lower and lower and lower, which you would imagine to be true because a big ticket item like a car is probably the first thing you decide not to buy. And it's probably the last thing you decide to buy as times get better. And so this is important to keep in mind with respect to the caution we put in budgeting forward. It's also important to keep in mind why we need a sustainable source of funding for transit. This is the reason right here. Motor vehicle sales tax will not sustain transit needs and demands even as they currently exist.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are the reserve amounts set by council policy or is that state mandated?
Chair, committee members, the reserve amounts that the council has set are around $15 to $18 million is what we need in minimum reserves. Are you talking motor vehicle sales tax reserve?
I'm talking in general, the reserves that that are budgeted is that set by Met Council policy?
Chair, committee members, yeah. The reserves for the respective units range anywhere from about 8.3% up to about 10 to 15%. That is set in Council Policy 3-8.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, go ahead,
Ed. Chair, committee members, a couple of things I want to point out with motor vehicle sales tax, as Mr. Koister had mentioned. One of the volatilities and one of the indicators, motor vehicle sales tax for us is an indicator of what's happening with the economy. Because as you are watching the economy and as you think about your own personal household, if the economy is starting to soften, one of the first things that you're probably going to do in your own household is you think about the big purchase ticket items that you're going to think about buying. You know, you still have to buy groceries, you have to pay your mortgage, those types of things. But the one item you may not buy is a brand new car. So that's one of the things that we have found is a very strong leading indicator of what's happening with the economy. If the economy is going strong, people are buying cars. If the economy starts to go soft, those are one of the things that people back off. They think, well, I can probably drive my car for another 1 or 2 years. That is one of the challenges we have with the motor vehicle sales tax. One of the other challenges that, that as a finance person, I don't like as far as motor vehicle sales tax is one of the things that we want people to buy a vehicle, buy a very nice vehicle, pay the motor vehicle sales tax, put it in your garage, and ride transit. That's just kind of one of my things. It doesn't make sense as a dedicated source of revenue for transit operations. That was my little editorial. Tracking financial outlook. So with our financial outlook, one of the things that we also do is we actually look at apologize here. Tracking, we look at our period, we look at our financial outlook for a period of 5 years. We look at current year plus the next 2 bienniums. Within that, we'll use current law, state appropriations, forecasts from the state of Minnesota for motor vehicle sales tax. If we do anything on motor vehicle sales tax beyond the 4-year period, we'll actually tie in and use the forecasts that MnDOT is using. We'll actually use their forecasts for anything beyond 4 years. Generally, our updates on the toolbox or the financial outlook that we are using is we actually do it at minimum twice a year. With every motor vehicle sales tax update in February and November, we'll redo our financial outlook and forecast everything out. And then we'll also do it another time if there's any legislative action that has adjusted anything. For example, this year, like with Metro Mobility with state appropriations, it causes then a re-trigger and a relooking of our forecasts. Some of the other things that we look with our forecasts is, first of all, we want to look at our financial position. We look at all of our funding of our expenses assumptions. We look at use of reserves. And one of the things that we do want to point out is, as a result, one of the things that the council had made a decision a few years ago to do is we looked very closely at the motor vehicle sales tax. We also looked at our multi-year outlooks, looked at our forecasts, and looked at the volatility in motor vehicle sales taxes. So one of the things that the council chose to do is actively build reserves. Because we were looking at our multi-year forecast, we knew the cliff was coming. And we knew one of the things that we were living on was year-to-year, one-time state appropriations. So it was just like the ball was getting kicked down the road, but the structural problem was never getting solved. We realized that we couldn't be the full solution, but we could also be part of the solution to help solve everything. So one of the things that we actually looked at within our own transit operations. We looked at savings that we could actively captivate and pull together to help to build our reserves to help with that structural problem. Some of the things that we've had over the last year or two is, as Mr. Koister has talked about, we've had a bus operator shortage. We have been saving money as a result of not having of the bus operator shortage. This isn't a position that we like to be in, but it is forcing savings to our bottom line. Those savings are have been going into our reserves to be used for the future outlook. When we talked about looking at our service, we look at our service compared to all the regional standards. One of the things that we do is that, some of the routes are not hitting the regional standards. We do a process that we call harvest and reinvest. We'll take it out of one route and reinvest it into another route that does show promise or has had requests across the region for additional service. That is one of the things that we have curtailed over the last 3 years, is not reinvesting as much of that so we could save that money into our reserves. And we've also held open some short-term opening of positions, which, any business, you can do that on a short-term period. It's not something you could do long-term, but it has helped to build some of our reserves. But this is the structural position slide that I did want to talk about. This pretty well tells the story on what has happened with our structural position. First of all, this reflects our 2020 proposed operating budget, and the February 2019 state invest forecast is broken up from fiscal years 19 through 23. And I'll just go through the lines very quickly. First of all, this is base operations for transit operations. This includes the whole council family: Metro Transit Bus, Light Rail, Commuter Rail, Metropolitan Transportation Services, Contracted Services, Transit Link, Planning, the whole council transit operations. The revenue portion of this includes our revenues, which reflects base law, motor vehicle sales tax, what we're currently getting in motor vehicle sales tax from the forecast from the state, base law state appropriations, passenger fares, which are based on the current fare policy established by the council. It includes some advertising income. It also includes our local funding partners for the rail lines. With our rail lines, both light rail and commuter rail, we actually have 5-year master operating funding agreements. When CTIB ceased to exist, they went to the respective counties. We then developed a 5-year master operating funding agreement and then set the basis for the subsidy funding from the respective counties, whether it's Hennepin, Ramsey, Anoka. We also have funding agreements with MnDOT and with Sherburne County for North Star. Those are all built into our structural financial position on all of our revenues. Operating expenses reflects the operating expenses, forecasted revenue, operating expenses for all the divisions, which then brings us down to our structural position, which is revenues less expenses. So you can see, let's just go down the first row, 2019. 2019, our structural position came in at a negative $41 million. As I mentioned, we had received one-time funding, one-time state base or one-time funding for state appropriations in state fiscal years 18 and 19 of $70 million. We used $30 million of that in state fiscal year 18. We used the balance in state fiscal year 19. With that, and with just an addition of $2 million worth of reserves for some minor adjustments we have, we were able to balance our financial position in 2019 with the one-time money. Moving on to 2020 and 2021. You can see, respectively, we have a negative structural position of $43 and $49 million. As we talked about earlier, we have received non-base state appropriations, one-time money of $36 million. We have put that into this chart. You can see moving then into state fiscal years 22 and 2023, there's zero. Because under current state law, it goes back to its base. So with state fiscal years 20 and 21, as a result of building our reserves, our council transit operation reserves, which you had asked about, we're able to use $20 million worth of reserves in state fiscal year 20 and another $35 million in 21. Virtually within $1 million, it balances us within those years. Now let's march forward into state fiscal year 2022. This is where the challenge starts to hit us, which will then require us to go back to the legislature and ask for additional state appropriations. We have a structural deficit of $59 million. We have no more one-time increases to the base, no more one-time funds. We have $12 million of available reserves. As I mentioned, the council has a reserve balance anywhere from 8.3 basically on transit operations to 10% of your operating expenses. We have $12 million left above the council minimum target. So after we've used our reserves, we still have a structural deficit in state fiscal year 22 of $47 million. That continues to grow in state fiscal year 23 up to $65 million. So unless we get any type of relief from the legislature, a new type of revenue source, I know Governor Wallace had proposed a different type, some different revenue sources, sales tax options within this legislature, or if we get additional, or if we can get additional, if we don't get additional state appropriations, this is what we are facing in state fiscal years 22 and 23. I know, Mr. Kreuster, did you want to add?
Yeah, I'd only say, Madam Chair, that again, the history has been that they've been plugging for with one-time money, and this again is the argument for a structural solution to budgeting for transit and its own revenue source. I will say that when Mr. Petrie talked about some of the actions that were taken and some of the things that happened to us with regard to the driver shortage that improved our positioning, and we were able to drop to the bottom line so that we can last as long as we are. That beginning this year, we began to start reinvesting in our services in terms of the care of our trains and our vehicles, the care of our stations and platforms and bus stops, and we're continuing to do that because it becomes a bottom line where you start degrading the service so much because you're facing the fiscal cliff, you lose ridership and you lose riders. And ironically, what we were facing last session was questioning why we were dropping money to the bottom line if we're claiming that we have a funding problem. Well, one story was the bus operator shortage, which is something that we don't want to sustain in any way, shape, or form. The other reason was we were being frugal so that we could create a bridge to when funding did arrive. And at the same time, we're getting the same concerns from legislators we were hearing from our customers about the condition of our trains or the condition of our buses or safety along certain concerning bus stops and stations. So I want this body to know that we're trying to find that sweet spot of keeping our services where they need to be to meet customer demands and still making wise investments as we go forward in doing that. And you'll see that as we go forward with the budget presentation a little bit.
Any questions first? I will just say that, well, quickly, what's on the screen, it really highlights why this volatility and lack of sufficient funding really puts us in a position where it makes some long-term planning very challenging. And so I think that you can see some of the things that we've been struggling with over the last couple of years and understand sort of the direction that we need to kind of keep in mind as we proceed. All right, go ahead, Ed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
And one of the other things that I didn't mention also is the fact is with motor vehicle sales tax, like I stated, it's a very, which you will see in one of the slides, it's 47% of our transit budget, of our operating sources. And this is a revenue source that, because of volatility, like if you look from February 17th to November 17th, it dropped $111 million. It was just a huge drop. So motor vehicle sales tax, we receive the updates every single month. We watch the updates internally, our finance folks, we watch it very closely, very, very closely. And if we see anything that's trending negatively or more negatively than what we had anticipated, with motor vehicle sales tax, there is the seasonality of when people buy their vehicles. So we know based on seasonal trends, the ups and downs, we watch those trends very closely. But if it's starting to veer off, that is something that we huddle all around very quickly and start looking at the forecast and re-challenging the forecast to say, what can we do? So that is something I just wanted to say, it's volatile, but we watch very closely.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. I don't doubt that there may be some softening to our economy. We're seeing a downtrend in philanthropy. It just got reported last month. Even in a time of prosperity, we saw 3 times to the opposite of giving of individuals. So there's something in the air. But I also wonder about if there's any conversation around the population shift in the region and the population, the largest population growing in age, and the likelihood that they'll be transitioning out of single car ownership and to using services like Metro Mobility, in that demographic shifts. So speaking of baby boomers retiring and aging, that's the hugest single generational group. So I'm just curious if that conversation has come up much also, because that's kind of a double-edged, that's not a double-edged sword, it's like a double 1-2 kind of punch, in that you have a population growing, declining maybe in car purchases, and the largest group generationally, and also upticking in a demand on our service, Metro Mobility, or public transportation in general.
Chair, committee members, do you want to talk about the Metro Mobility piece a little bit?
So, Madam Chair, council members, maybe I can give about the 100,000 foot level, then I may need to hand it off to Nick Thompson or Jerry Sutton for the rest. There was a study done to try and get a better handle on longer term Metro Mobility forecasts, which goes to, I think, part of your question. And it did actually, I believe, show a little bit of a leveling off of the Metro Mobility demand over time. And if you're looking for more details than that, I may need to hand it off to one of my colleagues.
Madam Chair, Councilmember, we looked at kind of trying to divide the demographics of our ridership and Metro Mobility to look at that future forecast. And what we know is that the bulk or the growing part of our customer base Metro Mobility is older generations, but they use the service less than the working age Metro Mobility because they're using it on more a daily basis. And so we're kind of forecasting a leveling off for a variety of reasons. But as you'll probably see later, it's really hard to forecast Metro Mobility growth. It's very volatile, other than we know there's growth. And so we're watching that closely. I think their forecasts in the nearer term, I think we're a little more confident, but that demographics are going to change our Metro Mobility ridership, our transit ridership, a lot of factors in ways that are built into our modeling of our future 2040 and things like that.
All right, Gentleman Requestra.
Yeah, Madam Chair, also Councilmember, I think with respect to the other part that you talked about, that are we shifting away from car purchases? I don't have the answer to that, but I will say that we have in the community development division people who do long-term forecasting, and that would have to be, I think that factor would have to be looked at in terms of what influx of new population we're receiving and what their driving habits would be. We're certainly, to your point, as people age, they're going to be probably purchasing fewer cars. I'm not sure how that's offset by the people who are projected to come into the state as new residents.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Chair. Also, then there raises the question also of ride sharing, Uber, Lyft, things like that. And if you use them, even if you use them periodically, as a person who has, we have 2 cars, we need to have 2 cars, we use them less. I mean, I'm going to commit to buying a new car every year just to keep that up there. But so what's the impact of that?
We'll give you a transit pass.
But what's the impact on the budget with those kinds of options that are in our face and really important and becoming more and more popular?
Chair, members, one of the things, like you mentioned, it's one of the things that we're working with our analysis. We're actually looking at our ridership, really looking at the bus ridership and trying to break down. One of the things we'll talk about in the budget is we've had a challenge on our bus ridership. It's down. It's continuing to be down between 4% and 5% from the prior years. We're looking at it very closely. We do know we're trying to determine what the impacts are, like of Uber, Lyft, all those types of alternative sources of, modes of transportation. So those are, you're totally right. Those are things that we are looking at.
Okay.
So.
Okay, Councilmember Sterner.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I just was going to add where they already had partially on, like bicycling and young people moving to the urban centers. But the thing I was going to add too, that we're looking at this structural deficit, but I think from a staff member and from a council, we need to be looking at regularly looking at our fares too, to make that kind of normal. But 8 years is quite a long time to be really looking at that on a financial standpoint. Yep. So I think, that we should put our own structure in place too, with looking at that.
I would agree, but I can tell you, having gone through a fare increase there, a change in fare does not solve all of that.
No,
So,
I get it. So, yeah, there's no like one
yeah,
perfect.
it does need to be reevaluated on a periodic basis, but there are other issues at play.
And generally, at chair committee members, one of the things that we've found with fare increases, just if you want to just say like a 25-cent across the board fare increase, generally a 25-cent across the board fare increase, we will lose around 5% in ridership. And these are also information that we have obtained from APTA, the American Public Transit Association. They have similar statistics of other agencies across the United States. Generally, like a 25-cent, you'll lose about 5% ridership. Takes about 24 months to recoup that ridership. One of the things that we found with our last fare increase, which was in October 2017, ironically, our blue and the green line and the North Star lines acted somewhat counter-interactive to that. Even with the fare increase, the very first year, the blue and the green line were up 4 to 5%, even after a 25-cent fare increase. Our bus system went down. It went down to 5%. And it's held at between 4 to 5% down since our fare increase. So the bus system acted historically like you would anticipate. Our rail lines were counteractive to what we had anticipated.
Interesting.
Sheriff?
Yep, and just quickly, and we'll work with staff to bring forward a presentation about the current fare policy and how we went through the increase, just so you have some context and we can figure out where to go from there. All right, go ahead, Ed.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So the financial position, so breaking it down just by the respective business lines, you can see the large portion is, like I mentioned, Metro Mobility, $35 million shortfall in 22 and $42 million in 23. The rail operations will start to have a shortfall starting in 2023. And then bus operations starts in 22 and 2023. But Metro Mobility is the largest portion of it. Reserves, as we had talked about, the council does have a policy, 3-8, which is council fund balance policy. It generally sets the reserves anywhere from 8.3% to 10%. The planning function does have a separate reserve in at 30%. But what this slide is to depict for you is that you'll see our reserve balances at the end of 2018. We have a planned use of reserves in 2019, planned use of reserves in 2020, and you can see what the target is, what our projected at the year in 2020 would be, and our respective targets. The point of this is we have a planned use of reserves, and as of the end of 22, which we just talked about previously, all of our business units will be at the reserve minimums. So we'll be at council minimum. So as you saw in that one previous slide, this slide right here, we're going to use our final $12 million in 22. We then have a remaining deficit of $47 million. So as of 22, we will be at the minimum reserves for all business units for council policy. Now,
I'm going to have you pause just there. Right now, we are on slide 17 of 42. And so the budget, we need to see it before it's presented to the full council by division. We have another opportunity potentially on August 12th to see it. It'll then come as an information item, the full budget to the full council on August 14th.
Correct.
And so there's another opportunity. I'm going to leave it to the will of the committee. So because there's a lot more to go through, but it's up to you guys. If you want to keep going or.
Chair committee members, I would anticipate it'll be 35, 40 minutes probably.
May I see?
Go ahead.
And Madam Chair, council members, the other option is we could give you the really high preview today and come back with more detail. So whatever your pleasure.
Discussion? Councilmember Zarin?
Are there more items that we need to be presented before now and then that would congest a future meeting?
Let's see, I'm looking to my director here.
I'm sure there's some info items we could look at pushing out or not. There'll be some regular business items, I'm sure, but not. I guess I haven't looked ahead that 2 weeks, but.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm not acquainted with the schedule.
And I'm not aware of anything in particular. And like I said, we could certainly arrange for detailed briefings even, and
Chair committee members, we could try to keep it down to about a half hour if you want to move through it.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you. I just think this is so critically important, especially that we're approaching the cliff and we all know that, we can see that I think it deserves a time, either tonight or another time. If we can't do it tonight, maybe the overview, the high level overview, and then, but I just think it raises so many questions that 30 minutes is going to be 40 or 45 or whatever, and out of respect for time, maybe we can.
Councilmember Sterner?
Yeah, and I just noticed we're already missing 3 council members right now, so if it's really important, I think we want to be as close to a full council, if not a full council, we can see the numbers.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen?
I just ditto that. I also am getting really thoughtful about the just amount of information we can take in. Just there's a lot in there, and wanting to make sure that we're getting to a point where we're having quality in that retention and conversation as well. And there's just kind of a limit after a full day of work, and then taking in budgetary information. Personally, for me, takes a little more effort than other types of information.
So how about this? I propose this. You give us a quick 10-minute kind of snapshot of what they should be looking for as because you've all got copies of the presentation. Go in and review that. In between now and then, if you want to set up one-on-one sessions with any of these guys to walk through things and get a little more detail, we'll make sure we get that taken care of. And then we'll have the full presentation of the rest of or what we have for the budget on August 12th when we've got everyone here.
So we'll come back and we would come back then and present from this slide on, then go through the transportation portion.
Yes,
Yeah,
from
on
on that day, but give a snapshot of what all of they should pay attention to and look at specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a lot.
Okay.
And I do understand learning the complexities of all this, so it's a lot of information.
Okay, Chair, committee members, let's. I'll go into a lot more detail on the 12th, but overall, the type parameters within our budget framework, our budget has been based on, like everything we talked about, setting up what we have: the motor vehicle sales tax, state appropriations, council policy on fair policy, all those types of items. That's what the type parameters that have been used to develop our framework. One of the things that Mr. Cloyster did talk about is some of the 2019 customer improvement initiatives that we have started, that we're putting in 2019, that will now annualize into 2020. That's one of the big changes that are annualizing into the next year that we are putting in, or that are included in the budget. Some of those items include, that's some of the things I would like to talk about is first of all, we have improving customer communications. We've added 3 staff to our transit control center to support improving information with our Next Trip software, giving real-time information to our riders, social media notifications, and text for safety. We're also working, as Mr. Cloyster talked about, improving our conditions at our facilities and on our trains. Cleanliness, those types of items. We're actually adding 16 staff to our trains and to our bus system, a total of addition of 16 staff to maintain the facilities. And focusing on winter performance and snow removal. And then we're also looking at enhancing security and safety in our trains, building on some security enhancements we made this year. LRT enforcement, and increased patrol officer time on both our buses and our trains. So that's some of the budget framework. The overall proposed transportation budget, which we'll get into at a future time, is $621.5 million. And you'll see on the left-hand side is the various revenue sources. You'll see motor vehicle sales tax, as we talked about. It's a very volatile revenue source. 42% of our revenues is motor vehicle sales tax. We have state appropriations in at 18% or $110 million. That's based upon state law. Federal money coming in for some of our capital salaries, CMAQ grants, those types of items. Fares in at $113 million. You'll see the county's contribution at 66% of the budget. Once again, that's the county's, their subsidy contribution on the light rail and commuter rail. Planned use of reserves, as we have talked about. The other funds transfer, what that is the 5%, or what I mentioned. Any collections that we receive in excess of 95% on motor vehicle sales tax goes into a reserve to be used for the next year's operations. We have collections above the minimum reserve that we need in motor vehicle sales tax. So we're bringing in $25 million worth of collections of prior year's motor vehicle sales tax into this year's budget. Other revenue would be mainly advertising revenue, interest income. Advertising revenue is you see all of our buses wrapped, our trains wrapped. That generates quite a bit of revenue for us. On the expense side, you see the family of council services, the bus system, Metro Transit buses, about 58% of our budget, $358 million. You see the Metro Transit capital portion, that is capital salaries for folks that are working on capital projects, operating people that are working on capital projects, like building our new Minneapolis bus garage or working on the Southwest project, those types of items. We capture their salaries here, and then they're paid for via federal funds or capital funds. We have the green line and the blue line, North Star. You'll see Metro Mobility, 15% of our budget, or $94 million. We have the Transportation Planning Unit, Transit Link, and then regular route service. So overall, at a very high level, our proposed budget is $621 million. The final slides after this would then go into the detail on Metro Transit or Metropolitan Transportation Services. So Chair, that's what I would recommend stopping as of this point, and then we would go into further detail as to what makes up these numbers.
Perfect. Everyone good with that? Anyone have any interim questions here? I know it's a lot to digest. All right. Thank you guys, and thank you for the information. It's
Thank
very
you.
helpful. All right. So that our last order of business is adjournment. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move, Chair.
Second.
And all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.